Hey guys, it's May from Markets with May, and this is episode 4 of Why is the SEC suing Binance and Coinbase? In this episode, we're going to focus in on the Coinbase lawsuit, and while there are differences from the Binance lawsuit in episode 3, it may be helpful to have a watch on that video as well to understand why there's such concern on this topic. Now, I'd also mention that you will need a fairly decent grasp of staking as a service and understanding why the SEC is upset about that. That's in episode 1. You'll want to understand why the SEC requires that the broker-dealer, the exchange, and the clearinghouse function are 3 separate entities, each with their own regulation. That's really covered in episode 2. Now, unlike the Binance lawsuit, there are no known whistleblowers at this time at Coinbase, and let's just give them the benefit of the doubt that none will come forward. As a result, the Coinbase document primarily focuses on failing to register the entities and separating them into 3 different parts, and also the selling of securities, including all of the disclosures that you're supposed to do and all of the protections that you're supposed to do surrounding that. Now, I'm going to organize this video in 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about the component related to failing to register the broker-dealer, the exchange, and the clearinghouse. Second, we're going to talk about staking as a service, which is one of the 2 types of securities that Coinbase is offering without registering with the SEC. Third, we're going to talk about the SEC's claim that Coinbase is offering securities in the guise of tokens, which tokens specifically that it's focused on. And finally, we're going to talk about Coinbase's appeal, which claims that the SEC wasn't providing enough information for them to register. Before we get into that, past performance is not indicative of future returns. I do have a small butterfly short position that really is just a hedge against the entire markets using Coinbase. As far as crypto goes, I own BITO, which is the Bitcoin ETF. I do have some Satoshis, some Ethereum, and XRP. Also, if these videos are helpful, it'd be awesome if you would like, share, comment, or subscribe to my channel. That always helps me know what types of media I should make. Now let's get into item 1. Coinbase has failed to register as an exchange, broker-dealer, and clearinghouse. Now, what can make this document a little bit hard to go through is that the first claim that you really get to on page 19 is the idea that Coinbase knew that it was an exchange, clearinghouse, and broker-dealer and should have filed. So that part comes first, and then the latter parts of the document demonstrate the securities that were sold on Coinbase. Then you have to go back to the first part of the document to understand that if you are going to sell those items unregistered, you also by definition are failing to disclose properly. Now from page 19 to page 30, they really do describe how complete this business is, including having the order entry component, the custodian component, a prime broker, full solicitation and education of investors. They go all the way through every piece.
This matters a lot because thus far they've been claiming that they sell commodities and should be regulated by the CFTC, but so many parts of their organization look identical to a broker-dealer selling securities.
The top of page 31, they describe this team that exists at Coinbase, specifically designed to help people write their white paper and manage the verbiage so that they can skirt becoming a security token and maintain themselves as a commodity token. Now, the SEC is saying that this group helped people change their white paper to have less problematic statements as relates to the Howey rule. It also advised on what not to say in press releases and other communications with the public. On page 106, they also describe the fact that Coinbase founded and headed this crypto rating council to rate and identify which coins were unlikely to pass the Howey rule. In other words, they were rating them to the degree to which they were probably a security. Now, a lot of this comes down to the fact, did Coinbase know it was supposed to register with the SEC? And in this regard, the SEC is using the S1 in a way that very much so differs from how Coinbase is spinning it in the press. In other words, they're saying that given what the S1 said, there was knowledge at Coinbase that a lot of what they were offering was in fact going to be in violation of SEC regulation because it was probably a security. Now on page 36, item 127, it talks about 7 different tokens that were a part of SEC scrutiny and therefore delisted in February. And it says, hey, Coinbase was trading these, none of these passed the Howey test, and Coinbase should have known that. Now then it goes through the coins that it feels are potentially securities, but I'm going to hit a pause right there and then talk about staking as a service. In episode 1, we talk about the different parts of staking as a service. Now the point of all this in brief is that staking as a service is a security and as such requires certain representations and certain disclosures that they believe customers aren't getting. Now, some people might be like, what do you mean disclosures? And really, it's the idea that this is not some sort of bond, mutual fund, or deposit-based interest. When you are giving over your assets for staking, number one, you lose control over them. And number two, what's actually happening is that Coinbase is reinvesting them into other things. I think the reason the SEC feels strongly the disclosure is not there is because in so many advertisements, the way that staking as a service is portrayed is annual yield or an APR or APY. In contrast, given how the returns are achieved, they would prefer you to do this as a private placement memorandum where you describe clearly the business model and what the cost and fees are, as well as what management's take is. They would also want you to clearly explain the business risks, which include slashing, cyber attacks, validators themselves committing fraud, and also the idea that Coinbase is the one that is backstopping or insuring against these types of items. In other words, unlike your deposits at a bank that might be FDIC insured, or in a credit union, they might have an insurance company come in, when a slasher, a cyber attack, or a fraudulent validator is involved, it's really Coinbase paying out of pocket. And so if Coinbase doesn't have the money, then you have an issue. That's what the SEC wants disclosed because that's more like a business risk and is why the staking as a service in general is seen as the issuance of a security. Talk about the idea that CGI is the principal that is taking benefit at a rate that's largely speaking undisclosed. Additionally, they believe that folks are unaware that as Coinbase has more participation, the returns are more viable. And the opposite is also true. Such on page 91, they don't believe that investors understand that when they give over their Ethereum, they have risk to all the other coins that are in the pool. The SEC is saying that because during the period of staking as a service, the customer has no access to their coins because they've relinquished it over to Coinbase, that this is a failure on the custodian side, and also this makes it 100% a security. And we're going to get into that a bit further when we discuss the appeal that was filed in April. But before we go there, I do want to mention the securities that were talked about that have not yet received any kind of action from the SEC for being a security. Now, there were 11 tokens that were named, and some have flat out just said, we are a commodity token. And in episode 5, I will discuss the difference between commodity, utility, and security tokens. One of the 11 is probably going to have a weaker claim because they did actually file with the SEC more than once different private placement memorandums. The point is that they went to the private markets as a security, but when they did the same thing in the public markets, they claimed that they were a commodity. Now, interestingly, the last one on the list is Voyager Digital, which blew up in a blaze of glory. And part of what's really relevant to know is that if these are in fact security tokens, they would need to properly file a
And if instead they wanted to trade publicly, they would need to file a prospectus with the SEC, and then they would be able to trade on an exchange that's approved by the SEC, meaning Coinbase would also have to be registered. Now, the prospectus is somewhat like a business plan. It's going to include the business details. It won't include forward estimates, but it will include the existing financials, if they've already raised capital, being there, who their investor are, business risks, conflicts, things of that nature.
Let's be really specific on this. Having the SEC approve your disclosures is not the same as having the SEC sign off on your company in a particular way. You still have to do proper licensing and all these other things, complying with state, federal, local laws. What the SEC does when you register for a security is check that the disclosures are there. Investors can sue in a very particular way, getting certain types of benefit from the fact that the regulators can get involved. Now, like I said, I will go into this in greater detail in episode 5, but the last coin on this list is kind of important. It's Voyager. And realizing that the disclosures on Voyager, the types of business activities that it was involved in, which included other bank-like products using the coin and creating leverage, that sort of stuff would have been needed to be disclosed in the filings. Now let's talk about the appeal that was filed on April 26, 2023. Now this appeal was in reaction to a Wells notification that the SEC gave to Coinbase. Wells notification really is a final notification that the SEC is going to take action against you. Now the appeal suggests that the SEC has had mixed messages on whether or not Coinbase needs to register or the nature of the registration. Interestingly enough, it surrounds this virtual meeting in May of 2021. Now, obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but when I read this documentation, the problem I have with it is that it creates an ellipsis in the sentence, meaning it cuts off the most important verbiage from what was said. To show you the sentence in the documentation, the exchanges trading in these crypto assets do not have a regulatory framework either at the SEC or our sister agency, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, then ellipsis. Right now, there is not a market regulator around these crypto exchanges. The problem I have with this is that if I read this section right before this and right after this, the context is the custody part of the business, not the broker-dealer and not the exchange component. Now, further in the document, they use this statement.
Here again in the appeal, they pretend as if SEC, when reviewing the S1, was saying that there's no certainty around most digital assets. In other words, it's ambiguous whether digital assets are securities. However, now here's the letter that went to Brain Armstrong, and I'll put a link down below. But where it's saying that there is no certainty under the applicable legal test, it looks more like they're trying to make sure that in the S1, unlike how it's originally worded, which is to say that Bitcoin and Ether are commodities, they wanted people to understand that given the nature of what Coinbase does, some of them will be commodities and some of them will most definitely be securities.
In all of the examples that are used where there's no certainty that a crypto asset will be a security, it's immediately followed that each security or each token will need to try to pass the Howey test. Now, it doesn't really matter what I think. It only matters what the judges and the courts think. Now, I'll put a link to the appeal so you can read it yourself, and I'll include the citations since you can't cut and paste the hyperlinks that are provided in the document. Now, which way the courts will rule, that will get very interesting. Even more interesting is if these become regulated entities, what will Coinbase then have to do strategically? Additionally, what will it have to provide in the way of regulation compliance and disclosure as to what's going on internally? And also, if anything that's then provided as a function of that looks more like Binance, all of that is shaping up to be a very interesting story. Now, that's all I have for this episode. If you'd like to see the previous episodes, they are located here along with all my other Web3 content. Additionally, if you're interested in the next episode on the 3 different types of coins, that will be here. Finally, it would be amazing if you would like, share, comment, or subscribe. That helps me know what types of media to make. Until next time, good luck in these markets.